The golden hues of the setting sun stretched across the empty highway, broken only by the roar of motorcycles. In the center of a circle formed by the notorious biker gang, the Steel Serpents, lay Hank, a K9 German Shepherd, his fur smeared with dirt and streaks of blood. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his sharp eyes never lost their focus. Despite the pain coursing through him, Hank's training and unshakable spirit kept him standing, even as the gang jeered and taunted him. Across the road, hidden in the dry brush, James Harlow, Hank's handler, watched intently. A former military veteran turned field agent, James was known for his calm demeanor under pressure. But this time, rage simmered beneath his calculated exterior. Hank wasn't just a partner, he was family. Every second James waited felt like a lifetime, but he knew he couldn't act recklessly. His mind raced, searching for the perfect moment to rescue his loyal companion without putting him in greater danger. The bikers, drunk on their perceived dominance, paid no attention to their surroundings. One of them, a burly man with tattoos snaking down his arms, stepped closer to Hank, swinging a heavy chain in his hand. The dog, though battered, let out a low growl, standing his ground as a final act of defiance. The gang erupted into laughter, their arrogance blinding them to the storm that was brewing just out of sight. James took a deep breath, steadied his grip on the situation, and emerged from the shadows. His voice, cold and commanding, cut through the bikers' laughter like a knife. "Step away from him," he said, his tone brooking no argument. The gang turned, momentarily stunned by his presence. Hank, hearing the familiar voice of his handler, pushed through his pain and dragged himself to James's side. The sight of the battered dog standing loyally by his trainer sent a clear message. This fight was far from over. The bikers hesitated, the balance of power shifting as James and Hank stood together. Faced with an adversary whose determination they underestimated, the gang began to back away, muttering curses and promises of revenge. James didn't flinch, his focus solely on Hank. Kneeling beside the dog, he carefully examined his injuries. "You're tougher than all of them combined," he murmured, his voice softer now, filled with both relief and pride. As James prepared to carry Hank to safety, a glint of metal on the ground caught his eye. He reached down and picked up a small, unassuming object left behind by the bikers. Turning it over in his hand, he realized it might hold answers, or lead to even greater dangers. The battle for Hank's life had been won, but as James looked at the object, he knew this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. This was just the beginning of an incredible story of loyalty and courage. Leave a like to support us and subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters of this thrilling journey. The faint hum of sirens echoed in the distance as James carried Hank to the safety of his truck. The dog's breath was shallow, his once powerful frame now limp in James's arms. Carefully placing him in the back seat, James grabbed a first aid kit and began tending to the wounds. Hank flinched as the antiseptic stung, but his eyes stayed locked on James, a silent exchange of trust passing between them. "Hang in there, buddy," James whispered, his voice steady, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his worry. As James worked to stabilize Hank, his mind kept circling back to the small metallic object he had picked up earlier. It was a USB drive, seemingly left behind on purpose by one of the bikers. James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a careless mistake. The gang had been too deliberate, too confident during their ambush. Sliding the drive into his pocket, he decided he would investigate it as soon as Hank was stable. First things first, his partner came before everything else. Arriving at the nearest emergency vet clinic, James rushed inside with Hank in his arms. The staff sprang into action, guiding him to a treatment room. While the veterinarians examined Hank, James paced the waiting area, the USB drive weighing heavily in his hand. Every second without Hank felt like an eternity, but James's mind couldn't rest. The Steel Serpents weren't just a group of troublemakers, they were organized, and they had been targeting something or someone specific. After what felt like hours, the vet emerged, assuring James that Hank would recover but would need rest and further care. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. As James sat beside Hank, who now rested on a padded table, his thoughts turned back to the bikers. Why had they been so focused on taking Hank out of the picture? His instincts screamed that this was bigger than a simple ambush, and the USB drive might hold the answers he needed. Back in his truck, James inserted the drive into his laptop, half expecting it to be empty or corrupted. Instead, a series of files opened, revealing detailed information on weapons shipments, coded messages, and, most disturbingly, surveillance photos of Hank and James during previous missions. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a random encounter. The steel serpents had been tracking them for weeks, maybe months. James's pulse quickened as he scrolled through the files, each discovery raising more questions than answers. As the weight of the situation sank in, James glanced back at Hank, who stirred slightly but remained quiet. "Looks like we've stumbled into something big, partner," he murmured. Determined, James started the truck and drove toward his safe house. He knew they needed to regroup and figure out their next move, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. The steel serpents had made it personal, and James was ready to face whatever came next. The safe house was tucked away in the woods, far from prying eyes. James pulled into the gravel driveway, stepping out to survey the quiet surroundings. He carried Hank inside, gently placing him on a cushioned mat near the fireplace. The dog let out a soft whine, his injuries still fresh, but his gaze remained focused on James. "You're tough, Hank. We'll get through this," James said, patting his partner's head before turning to his laptop. He had no time to waste. The information on the USB drive demanded his full attention. Sitting at the old wooden table, James reopened the files. The surveillance photos made his skin crawl. The bikers had been watching him and Hank during missions, even capturing moments outside their operations. But what caught his eye next was a list of names, each one tied to high-profile individuals. Politicians, law enforcement officers, and private contractors were all listed with coded notes beside their names. James quickly realized the gang wasn't working alone. They were part of a larger network, one that extended far beyond the roads they terrorized. One name, however, stood out: Ryan Maddox, a former military operative turned private security consultant. James recognized the name instantly. Maddox had once been a trusted ally during their military days, but rumors of his involvement in shady dealings had ended his career. Seeing Maddox's name connected to the steel serpents sent a chill down James's spine. If Maddox was involved, it meant the gang's operations weren't just about smuggling weapons. They were part of something much more dangerous. As James pieced together the information, his thoughts were interrupted by a low growl from Hank. The dog struggled to sit up, his ears perked toward the door. James immediately grabbed his sidearm, his instincts kicking in. He moved silently to the window, peering out into the darkness. The faint sound of motorcycles in the distance confirmed his suspicions. They had been followed. "They don't waste any time, do they?" James muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. He quickly assessed the situation, locking the doors and securing the windows. Hank, though still weak, stood on shaky legs, his posture alert. James couldn't help but feel a surge of pride at his partner's resilience. "We've got this, Hank," he said, crouching next to the dog and giving him a reassuring pat. But deep down, he knew they were outnumbered. The steel serpents weren't coming to talk. They were here to finish what they started. As the sound of engines grew louder, James positioned himself by the door, his mind racing with plans. The safe house was stocked with emergency supplies and enough firepower to hold off an attack. But this wasn't just about survival. James needed answers, and he wasn't going to let the bikers leave without giving them. With Hank by his side, even injured, James knew they stood a chance. "Let's show them who they're messing with," he said under his breath, as the first set of headlights pierced through the darkness. The roar of motorcycle engines grew deafening as the steel serpents rolled into view, their headlights cutting through the darkness. James watched from the window, his breath steady as he counted the figures dismounting their bikes. 7 men, heavily armed and moving with purpose, spread out around the perimeter. They weren't taking any chances this time. James glanced at Hank, who was still standing despite his injuries. "We've been through worse," "Haven't we, buddy?" he said, giving the dog a nod of reassurance before moving to secure his position. The safe house wasn't much, but it had been built with defense in mind. Reinforced doors, bullet-resistant windows, and a small armory in the basement gave James a fighting chance. He quickly grabbed a tactical shotgun and a set of flashbangs, knowing he couldn't rely on brute force alone. Strategy and timing would be key. Hank, sensing the tension, limped to the doorway and positioned himself beside James, his growl low but steady. Even injured, Hank was ready to defend his handler. Outside, the gang's leader, a burly man with a patch reading stone, barked orders to his crew. "Flush him out. This ends tonight," he shouted. Two of the bikers approached the front of the house cautiously, their weapons drawn. James waited, his heart pounding in sync with the ticking seconds. As one of the men moved to kick in the door, James pulled the pin on a flashbang and tossed it out a side window. The explosion of light and sound sent the bikers reeling, buying him precious seconds to act. James moved swiftly, his years of military training taking over. He flanked the bikers from the side entrance, disarming one with a precise strike before taking cover behind a stack of firewood. The second man turned, firing wildly, but his shots went wide. James returned fire, hitting the biker's weapon and forcing him to retreat. From inside, Hank barked sharply, his instincts driving him to protect James despite his weakened state. As the chaos unfolded, Stone and the remaining bikers regrouped, realizing they had underestimated their target. Stone's face twisted in frustration as he shouted, "You're only delaying the inevitable. Harlow, we know what you've got and we're taking it." James clenched his jaw, now certain the USB drive was their true objective. He needed to find a way to neutralize the threat without destroying the crucial evidence in his possession. James retreated into the house, regrouping with Hank as the bikers began a more coordinated assault. He knelt beside his partner, placing a reassuring hand on the dog's head. "This isn't over, but we're not going down without a fight," he said firmly. The sound of boots approaching the porch signaled the next wave of the attack. James adjusted his grip on the shotgun, his eyes narrowing with resolve. Whatever happened next, he and Hank would face it together, proving once again that their bond was unbreakable. The night had grown colder, the tension in the air palpable as James positioned himself near the barricaded front door. The bikers were regrouping, their movements more coordinated now. He could hear them shouting orders to surround the house. The situation was dire, but James's mind was laser-focused. He glanced at Hank, who lay by his side, ears perked and eyes sharp despite his injuries. "This isn't just about us anymore, buddy," James murmured. "They're after something bigger, and we can't let them win." From the shadows outside, a sharp whistle pierced the night, followed by the sound of glass shattering. One of the bikers had thrown a Molotov cocktail through a side window, flames licking up the wooden walls of the safe house. James sprang into action, grabbing a fire extinguisher and dousing the flames before they could spread. The attack had begun in earnest. The bikers were testing his defenses, trying to force him into the open. But James knew better than to play by their rules. He retreated to the second floor, where he had a clear view of the surrounding area. Through the scope of his rifle, he saw Stone directing the assault. The gang leader was shouting into a radio, likely coordinating with someone outside the immediate scene. James's suspicion deepened. This wasn't just a local gang with a vendetta. They were part of a larger network, and Stone was only a cog in the machine. James adjusted his aim but hesitated. Taking out Stone might stop the immediate threat, but it wouldn't give him the answers he needed. Hank let out a warning bark, snapping James out of his thoughts. Two bikers had managed to breach the back entrance, their footsteps echoing up the staircase. James moved quickly, setting a trap with a flashbang. The explosion disoriented the intruders, giving him just enough time to neutralize them. Hank limped to James's side, his growl low but fierce. "Good boy," James said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The bond between them was unshakable, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the bikers outside regrouped, Stone's voice rang out again. "Harlow, We know you have the drive. Hand it over, and this ends now." James tightened his grip on his weapon, his mind racing. He knew the information on the USB drive was crucial, but he also realized he couldn't fight off the gang forever. He needed a plan to escape with Hank and the evidence intact. Time was running out, and every second brought the bikers closer to overwhelming his defenses. James's eyes darted to the underground escape hatch hidden beneath the floorboards. It was a risky move, but it might be their only chance. He knelt beside Hank, stroking the dog's head gently. "We're getting out of here, but I need you to stay strong for just a little longer," he whispered. Hank's ears twitched, his loyalty shining through his tired eyes. With determination, James prepared to execute his escape plan, knowing that the battle outside was just the beginning of a much larger war. What did you think of this action-packed chapter? Comment below. Your opinion is essential for us to keep creating exciting stories like this. Let's talk about James, Hank, and what's coming next. The air in the safe house was thick with tension as James lifted the hidden floorboard, revealing the narrow escape tunnel beneath. It wasn't ideal, dark, cramped, and barely wide enough for a man and a dog, but it was their best shot at survival. Hank stood by James's side, his breathing heavy but steady. "We've got to move fast, partner," James said softly, gripping the USB drive tightly in one hand and securing his weapon in the other. Outside, Stone and his gang were closing in. The sound of boots crunching on gravel and murmured commands told James they were preparing for a final push. He could hear Stone barking orders. "Flush him out. Tear the place apart if you have to." James lowered himself into the tunnel first, gesturing for Hank to follow. The dog hesitated for a moment, his instincts warning him of the confined space. But with a soft command from James, he climbed down, his loyalty outweighing his fear. The tunnel stretched far beneath the property, reinforced with wooden beams but barely lit by the dim light of James's flashlight. Each step was careful and deliberate, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Hank limped behind, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Above them, muffled crashes echoed as the gang began breaking into the house, their frustration evident. James felt the urgency rising, knowing they only had minutes before the bikers realized he was no longer inside. Halfway through the tunnel, James paused as a faint vibration rattled the walls. He froze, holding his breath, as the sound of footsteps approached from the far end of the passage. The steel serpents had anticipated his move. "They're smarter than I gave them credit for," James muttered under his breath. He quickly extinguished the flashlight and pressed his back against the wall, pulling Hank close. The darkness enveloped them, forcing James to rely on his training and instinct. As the footsteps drew nearer, James could make out faint voices. "He's got to be down here," one of them said. "Stone wants that drive no matter what." James tightened his grip on his weapon, his pulse steady despite the tension. When the first biker's silhouette appeared at the edge of the tunnel, James acted quickly, taking him out with a silent but precise strike. The second biker turned in surprise, but Hank lunged forward, his instincts overriding his injuries, and brought the man down. James knelt beside the dog, whispering, "Good work, Hank. Let's keep moving." With the immediate threat neutralized, James and Hank pushed forward, emerging at the end of the tunnel into a wooded area behind the safe house. The cold night air hit them like a shock, but it also brought relief. They were one step ahead for now. James scanned the area, his mind already formulating their next move. He knew this wasn't over. The gang wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But as he looked at Hank, battered but standing tall, James felt a surge of determination. They'd make it through this, together. The dense woods offered James and Hank a temporary refuge as they moved cautiously through the shadows. The faint hum of motorcycles in the distance reminded James that the gang wouldn't give up easily. He kept one hand on his weapon and the other steadying Hank, whose limp was becoming more pronounced. Just a little farther, James whispered, scanning the dark forest for any signs of movement. His breath formed clouds in the crisp night air, each step carefully placed to avoid noise. Reaching a small clearing, James knelt beside Hank to check his injuries. The dog was exhausted, his body trembling from both pain and exertion. James gently ran his hand over Hank's side, inspecting the worst of the wounds. "You've done more than enough, partner," he said quietly, his voice carrying both gratitude and concern. But even in his weakened state, Hank's eyes burned with loyalty, a silent promise that he wouldn't stop until James was safe. James pulled out his map, using the dim moonlight to pinpoint their location. A safe haven was still miles away, but the nearest option was an abandoned ranger station he had used once during a training mission. It wasn't ideal, but it would provide some cover. Folding the map, James decided they'd head there, knowing it was their best chance to regroup. As he stood, the faint sound of voices carried through the trees, sending a chill down his spine. The gang was closer than he'd hoped. Pushing forward, James guided Hank through the underbrush, their movements silent but swift. The forest seemed endless, every rustling leaf and snapping twig amplifying the tension. Suddenly, a beam of light swept across the trees behind them, followed by a gruff voice. "They're close. Spread out." James ducked low, pulling Hank with him as the light passed overhead. The steel serpents were combing the area, and their numbers were too great to confront head-on. James's mind raced as he weighed his options. A direct fight would be suicide, but evasion was growing increasingly difficult. Then he spotted a shallow ravine up ahead, partially hidden by thick brush. It was risky, but it could buy them time. "Come on, Hank," James murmured, helping the dog navigate the steep descent. They slid down into the ravine, crouching behind a large rock as the gang's footsteps grew louder above them. Hank's breathing was heavy, but he stayed silent, his training kicking in even under immense strain. As the footsteps passed overhead, James allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. He looked at Hank, who was leaning against him, tired but resolute. "We're not out of this yet, but we'll make it," he said softly, gripping the USB drive in his pocket. He knew the steel serpents wouldn't stop hunting them, but he also knew he had something they desperately wanted, and that gave him leverage. For now, survival was the priority, but James was already planning his next move. He wasn't just going to run, he was going to fight back. The abandoned ranger station loomed ahead, its weathered frame barely visible in the pale moonlight. James pushed the door open cautiously, the creak echoing in the stillness. Inside, dust blanketed the old wooden floors, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. It wasn't much, but it was a defensible spot. "We'll rest here for a while," James said, guiding Hank inside. The dog, clearly exhausted, sank to the floor with a soft grunt, his chest rising and falling heavily. James quickly assessed the space, checking for weak points and barricading the doors with whatever he could find. He discovered a rusted metal cabinet and some heavy chairs, enough to create a makeshift barrier. From the window, he could see faint lights moving through the forest, evidence that the gang was still searching. Time was running out, but James knew Hank needed a break. He crouched beside the dog, offering him water from a canteen. "You've done enough for now. Rest," he whispered, his voice softer than usual. As Hank drifted into a light sleep, James turned his attention to the USB drive. Plugging it into his laptop, he revisited the files, hoping for a clue to turn the tide in their favor. One document stood out, a detailed map with marked locations. It wasn't just about weapons. The steel serpents were part of a larger operation involving high-level trafficking routes. More troubling, the map included coordinates tied to local law enforcement offices. James clenched his jaw. Corruption ran deeper than he had imagined. Before he could dig further, a loud crash outside jolted him to attention. He peered through the window and spotted two bikers dismounting their motorcycles, flashlights cutting through the dark. "They're closing in," James muttered, grabbing his shotgun and positioning himself near the barricade. Hank stirred, ears perking up at the noise. Despite his injuries, the dog tried to rise, but James gently placed a hand on his back. "Not this time, partner. I'll handle it." The bikers moved closer, their voices low but audible through the thin walls of the station. "He's got to be in here," one of them said. James steadied his breath, waiting for the right moment. As the first biker tried to force the door open, James kicked it hard, sending the man stumbling backward. The second biker raised his weapon, but James was faster, firing a warning shot that sent him diving for cover. The element of surprise gave James the upper hand, but he knew the rest of the gang wouldn't be far behind. Retreating deeper into the station, James regrouped with Hank. The dog, though weak, stood at his side, ready to defend if necessary. "They won't stop," James said, more to himself than anyone else. He looked at the USB drive, then at Hank, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. They couldn't stay here much longer, but they needed a plan. As the sound of more engines approached, James tightened his grip on his weapon and prepared for the next wave. This fight was far from over. The engines grew louder, rumbling like thunder in the stillness of the night. James crouched near the window, scanning the dark forest as headlights cut through the trees. More bikers were closing in, and he knew the flimsy barricades wouldn't hold for long. His mind raced as he formulated a plan. "We can't stay here, Hank," James muttered, glancing at his injured partner. The dog, though visibly tired, perked up at his name, his loyalty unwavering despite his wounds. James moved quickly, gathering the few supplies he had left. He tucked the USB drive into a waterproof case and secured it inside his jacket. If the bikers got their hands on the information, the consequences would be catastrophic. As he packed, a sudden burst of gunfire shattered the silence, bullets tearing through the wooden walls. James instinctively dropped to the floor, shielding Hank with his body. "They're not playing around," he muttered, his jaw tightening. The gunfire paused, replaced by shouting from outside. "Harlow, we know you're in there. You've got nowhere to run." It was Stone's voice, dripping with overconfidence. James peered through a crack in the wall, spotting the gang's leader standing near a cluster of bikes. Around him, more men were positioning themselves, clearly ready for an assault. James's stomach churned. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but surrender wasn't an option. He turned to Hank, who was watching him intently. "We're going to have to fight our way out of this," James said, his voice steady but grim. Hank let out a soft growl, as if to say he was ready. Despite the odds, James felt a surge of determination. He set up a diversion, rigging a gas canister near the entrance with a makeshift fuse. It wouldn't stop the gang, but it would buy them precious seconds to escape. The moment the gang breached the barricades, James ignited the fuse. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was loud enough to disorient the bikers. Smoke filled the air as James grabbed Hank and bolted through a back window, landing hard on the ground outside. Hank stumbled but kept pace, his instincts driving him forward. They sprinted into the woods, the cover of darkness their only ally. Behind them, chaos erupted as the bikers scrambled to regroup. Breathing heavily, James pushed deeper into the forest, his grip firm on Hank's harness. He knew they couldn't run forever, but they needed to put as much distance as possible between them and the gang. The USB drive felt heavy in his pocket, a reminder of what was at stake. Glancing back at the faint glow of the ranger station in flames, James set his jaw. The fight wasn't over, but he and Hank had survived another round. Now, they just needed to figure out how to strike back. The forest was eerily silent as James and Hank pressed onward, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound breaking the stillness. James's breath came in steady bursts, his mind racing as he tried to calculate their next move. Hank limped beside him, his resolve evident despite his injuries. "We're almost there," James whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure where there was. The only certainty was that they couldn't stop until they were safe. As the first light of dawn broke through the canopy, James spotted an old, dilapidated cabin nestled in the trees. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging under years of neglect, but it would provide cover. He guided Hank inside, helping him onto a dusty rug before securing the entrance. The cabin had clearly been untouched for years, but it was sturdy enough to serve as a temporary hideout. "Rest here for a bit, buddy," James said, kneeling beside Hank and giving him a reassuring pat. James pulled out the USB drive, his mind turning back to the files he'd seen. The map and list of names painted a clear picture of a massive operation involving the steel serpents and their powerful allies. One name in particular, Ryan Maddox, still lingered in his thoughts. Maddox had been a trusted ally once, but his involvement with the gang suggested he'd turned rogue. James couldn't shake the feeling that Maddox was pulling the strings, and if they wanted to end this, they'd have to face him directly. The sound of rustling leaves outside snapped James out of his thoughts. He froze, hand instinctively moving to his weapon. Peering through a crack in the wall, he spotted a lone figure approaching the cabin. It wasn't one of the bikers. This person moved differently, cautiously, as if they were searching for someone. James gripped his gun tighter, waiting for the figure to come closer. When the person stepped into the clearing, James recognized the face immediately. It was Maddox. Maddox stopped a few feet from the cabin, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "James, I know you're in there," he called out, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to talk." James didn't lower his guard. He stepped out of the shadows, his weapon trained on Maddox. "Talk fast," James said, his tone cold. Maddox took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "The steel serpents are just pawns in a bigger game," he began. "And if you don't stop this, they'll destroy everything you've worked for." James didn't flinch, but his mind raced as he processed Maddox's words. Could he be telling the truth? Or was this another layer of deception? Before he could respond, Maddox added, "I can help you, but you need to trust me." James glanced back at Hank, who was watching the exchange intently. The dog's instincts had never failed him before. Turning back to Maddox, James lowered his weapon slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. "You've got 5 minutes," he said. Whatever came next would determine the fate of everything they were fighting for. If you enjoyed this thrilling and emotional story, how about supporting our work with a super sticker? It's an amazing way to help us keep bringing you heartfelt dog stories like this one. Show how much you're loving this adventure. Every bit of support makes a difference.